Always a pleasure to follow the Minister, the Honourable Nathan Guy, in this House. Something I tend to do quite a lot lately. I understand that the Minister dreams about making speeches in Parliament, and in fact has been known to wake up and find that he actually is, because he sets the House alight when he comes down here and speaks to us. Mr Speaker, I'm very happy to take this call on the Private Security Personnel and Private Investigators Bill. Just to... was it? Oh, I thought it was meant in good humour. Mr Speaker, there are three main changes to the current private investigator and security guard regime that are contained in this bill, a good bill introduced by my colleague, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove, during the tenure of the last Labour government. Another one of the many things that we did to give the new government an easy ride when they first came in. They had all this legislation that the Labour government had introduced that they could pass and made them look good, but all the hard work, Mr Speaker, was done before the National Government took office. Well, these things are ongoing. We were a very busy government, a very busy and productive Labour government it was. 7 years ago, I would have been, to do the maths, 25. So, Mr Speaker, the bill does three main things. It introduces licensing requirements, including police checks for criminal convictions, to an extended range of security-related activities, including crowd controllers, bouncers, bodyguards, private security staff, and those guarding people in legal custody. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those in a minute. Private security staff will be required for the first time in New Zealand to undertake training if their job is guarding property, guarding persons, or keeping order amongst groups of people. Essentially, training will be required if the nature of the work is such that there is a significant risk of physical violence occurring, and the details of the training will be made explicit via an order in Council. As the Minister just pointed out, a dedicated enforcement body, the Complaints, Investigation and Prosecution Unit, will be created to ensure compliance with the new legislation, and there will be heavier penalties for offending. Mr Speaker, I'd like to run through briefly now who's actually going to be covered by this piece of legislation. Security consultants will be covered by this. That covers anybody who is selling or attempting to sell a device of any kind, such as security cameras and so forth, burglar alarms, etc. Anybody wishing to advise the owner or occupier of a premises on the desirability of having any of such equipment installed on their premises will be covered. And it will also cover those working in secure document destruction. And I thought we had an interesting debate on that on the committee stage. My friend Simon Bridges pointed out, of course, that secure document destruction could prevent material getting into the hands of Nikki Hagar if it was done by appropriately licensed and trained people. Except, as I pointed out in the committee stage, Mr Speaker, if Mr English wasn't covered by this piece of legislation, which he's not, then of course there's no guarantees that those documents wouldn't still end up finding their way into Mr Hagar's hands somehow. And I understand that the police are still continuing to try and find out what happened there. Mr English obviously is very good, very, very good at covering his tracks, Mr Speaker. It also covers property guards, so the people who look after not just commercial premises but also private premises and so forth. I raised a question about the people who monitor security cameras, and I asked particularly about whether or not that would cover the likes of community patrol who assist the police in monitoring security cameras, and I didn't get an answer to that, unfortunately, during the committee stage of the bill. It also covers a crowd controller. Now, I thought this was quite interesting, the definition of a crowd controller, because it includes anybody who is in the business of screening entry into a place, keeping order in that place, or removing a person from that place. And I wondered, Mr Speaker, whether, in fact, Mr Brownlee might be covered by that legislation, because I understand that's the role that he performs at National Party conferences. Screens entry into the place, keeps order in the place, and he removes people from the place because when they cause a disturbance he throws them down the stairs. So, Mr Speaker, I wondered in fact whether or not this definition would cover the likes of Mr Brownlee, given his history as a crowd controller at National Party conferences. Mr. Speaker, it covers personal security guards. That's somebody who is involved in the guarding of a specific person or persons. Now, well, that could well be Mr. Brownlee as well. I don't know who exactly he was guarding. But, Mr. Speaker, so these people are all covered by this legislation, which introduces a licensing regime for them and a training regime for them. Because I think that we would all agree in this House, and I suspect we're all going to agree and all vote in favour of this very good piece of legislation introduced by the last Labor government, that ensuring people who are working in these types of jobs, ensuring that they are appropriately trained and qualified and registered is actually a very worthwhile thing to do. That would have been one of the motivations behind the last Labor government introducing this piece of legislation. I wanted to recap a little bit about why it is important that we revisit this legislation. The current Private Investigators and Security Guards Act of 1947, I think it's actually 1974. 1974 is outdated, and it doesn't reflect the changing role, changing expectations of the security industry in New Zealand today. Technology has changed hugely in that period of time. That's longer than I've been around, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid to say. And well, there were a few. There were one or two. And, Mr. Speaker, things have changed dramatically since then. The advent of modern technology, digital technology in particular, I imagine, has changed the role of many of these things. Private security cameras monitored remotely, I imagine, wouldn't have been very common in 1974, but these days are quite common. And so, what was that? It was all black and white in those days. Well, that's right. In fact, it was in the 80s that I got my first black and white television. We used to watch the Dukes of Hazzard back on the old black and white TV. So, Mr. Speaker, things have moved on since 1974. It was time that the law was updated. Private security personnel perform a very valuable and responsible role in the community, but there are risks associated with the type of work that they do. And in particular, we want to make sure that somebody who is put in a situation where where it could potentially become violent, we want to make sure that they are appropriately trained for that. So standards of practice and conduct amongst private security businesses and their staff, they vary widely at the moment. This poses a risk to their clients and the public, and of course the security personnel themselves. And these risks include to their own physical safety, the security of property, and in the case of private investigators, there are big risks to privacy, and I think that's something that clearly this bill is going to be addressing, and that is a good thing. Improvements are needed to ensure that security staff who are not currently required to be licensed are covered. So, bouncers, as I mentioned before, the example of Mr. Brownlee, he wouldn't be covered by the existing law. And I'm not sure that he's going to be covered by this law either, Mr. Brownlee, but perhaps he should be, given the very valuable role he performs as a frontline bouncer for the National Party conference. Mr. Speaker, the current Act doesn't require mandatory training of security staff. And I think Mr. Brownlee could probably use training in a number of other areas as well as in his role as the National Party's bouncer, possibly in his role as Leader of the House, and then he wouldn't have to extend the deadline for pieces of legislation to be enacted. But that's an issue for next week. I'm sure we'll come back to that again next week. Mr. Speaker, without proper training, to come back to the issue at hand, without proper training, staff could be exposed to potentially violent situations. And that's something that they need to be aware of. It's something that's almost unavoidable for those working in the security industry, particularly those working as bouncers in the hospitality industry. And so making sure that they are trained and know how to deal with that appropriately is something that I think is very important. Better enforcement and heavier penalties are needed to deter offending, including the problem of businesses and staff operating in the industry without being licensed when they should be. This bill introduces new penalties, new fines and so forth. That's something that I think is a very valuable thing. Overall, Mr. Speaker, I think this is a good bill. As I say, it was introduced by the last Labor government, one of the many pieces of legislation introduced by the last Labor government to make this government look good. I'd like to commend the Select Committee involved in hearing the legislation, and in particular compliment the Chair of the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, Mr. Chester Burrows. Always a pleasure when I have the opportunity to serve on that Select Committee. Overall, Mr. Speaker, this is a good bill and I commend it to the House.